A little boy was sick one Palm Sunday, and he stayed home with his mother. His father returned from church holding a palm branch. The little boy was curious and asked, "Well, why do you have that palm branch, Dad?" And Dad replied, "Well, you see, when Jesus came into town, everyone waved palm branches to honor him. So we got palm branches today." And the little boy replied, "Aw, shucks. The one Sunday I miss is the Sunday Jesus shows up." Our vision of Palm Sunday has been shaped over the centuries by the church's celebration of Palm Sunday, which always involves children in procession, waving palm branches, which we celebrated so wonderfully here this morning, which is all right. But are you ready for this? No gospel writer mentions that there were ever any children as he entered the city. Matthew mentions it later in a scene at the temple that there were some children there saying, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," but they weren't in the procession. And actually, only one gospel writer even mentions that there were palms. John is the one who says there was a great crowd that came out of the city of Jerusalem to greet him because they had heard that he raised Lazarus from the dead, and they were sure that that was the sign that he was the Messiah. But that's John's version. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John aside, here we all are again. We're on the brink of the remembrance of the central event of our faith. Holy Week and Easter shape who we are as followers of Jesus Christ more than any other single event. And it all begins with Palm Sunday. The curtain rises on this final act of the divine drama to a palm-strewn parade. And it's truly a mesmerizing story, but anyone ever, when it comes to this time of Holy Week, wish you could rewrite the ending? Alice McKenzie, who is a preaching professor at Wesley Theological Seminary, reminds us that good stories have a compelling protagonist, a believable supporting cast, a series of vivid scenes, and plenty of dramatic tension, and tells us that if you're going to do a good rewrite, you have to scrutinize all four of those elements to make improvements. So we're going to reflect this week on Luke's version of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, which is an event that we do find recorded in all four Gospels, of course, with variations. But Luke's version really does have a compelling protagonist, a believable supporting cast, a vivid central scene, and plenty of dramatic tension. I just don't know about you, but every year I get to this place and I really don't want Jesus to die the horrible death that he dies. I want his world to make different choices. So why does this story unfold the way it does? And what are the elements that pull it together for us as we look at it each year? I'd say the beating heart of the story begins with this wonderful connection between Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a colt and Zechariah's prophecy that a future king would come into Jerusalem in humility, riding on a colt. He's this sort of Messiah without pomp, a king laying claim to his city. So Luke, we read, specifies that Jesus is hailed as a king. So friends, this protagonist is perfect. In all three synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus sends two of his disciples into Jerusalem to find a colt for him to ride into Jerusalem. Jesus seems to know ahead of time just where the colt will be and what the response of the owner will be to being told the Lord needs it. And Luke shares with the other evangelists this portrait of Jesus as a true prophet whose prophecies are fulfilled and who somehow has knowledge of the secret workings of people's hearts. So this protagonist for this story is absolutely right on the money. In Luke, though, we think of all of these crowds of people surrounding Jesus when he enters the city. But in Luke, it's just the multitude of his disciples. Now, the other Gospels mention that there's a mixed crowd of all sorts of people, but in Luke, we see the disciples taking center stage. They throw their cloaks on the colt as a makeshift saddle, and they set Jesus upon it as a sign of honor due to a king. Matthew and Mark simply say that Jesus sat on the cloaks, not that he was placed there. And in Matthew and Mark, it's the crowd that shouts out hosannas and acclamations. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. But in Luke, the whole multitude of disciples says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and then adds the words, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. You see, in Luke, the disciples seem to sort of get who Jesus is and what he is intending by this symbolic parade. This is in contrast to John's version, where they don't get it until a whole lot later. So there's all sorts of dramatic tension in the story as Luke shows us how far we are from the peace on earth that reflects in this shout out that he calls the peace in heaven. Now, for those of us who are savvy with Luke, and we've been reading Luke since Advent, you might remember the birth story in Luke chapter 2, which is the pretty traditional one that we think of every Christmas time. And what do the angels prophesy? Peace on earth as the effect of the Messiah's birth. So in this chapter, Luke is reminding us that while peace is present and fashioned in heaven, it has not yet come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem has rejected the Messiah's peace, and now it will only be realized in the time to come. The kingdom is not yet appearing because of the city's rejection, but the king is at hand. Now, it's interesting to me that only here in Luke do we hear the Pharisees chide Jesus for his disciples' unruly demonstration. They express, I think, probably the sentiments of all Jerusalem toward Jesus. Order your disciples to stop. And only in Luke do we hear Jesus' eloquent reply, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. We wonder what on earth Jesus meant by that. Could it be a reference to Habakkuk, where the crying stones refer to the judgment of Israel? Or does Jesus mean that the stones would cry out against the disciples who sin by keeping silent? Or does he mean that the stones would cry out against the people who will reject and eventually silence him? Does he mean that if the disciples remain silent, the stones themselves will be forced to proclaim the mighty acts of God instead of them? Or does he mean that it's no more possible for disciples to keep silent than it is for stones to speak? So this scene certainly isn't lacking in some dramatic tension. And then comes the very next verse after that chastisement and response. When he drew near the city, he wept over it, saying, would that even today you knew the things that make for peace. He drew near the city on this donkey. If a king came to a city to seek peace with that city, the tradition was that he rode in on an humble avenue on like a donkey. So when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, he doesn't ride in as a conqueror on a steed or a horse as a conqueror would. He rides as a king who is coming to seek peace. How many of you know that the name Jerusalem means city of peace? Jerusalem. Salem is a form of, y'all should get this one, shalom. which is the Hebrew word for peace, the city of peace. So he approaches the city of peace as the Prince of Peace. It is a really big deal, and hardly anyone shows up except some grumpy old Pharisees who say, "You had better cool it, or we're going to put you in jail." So as he saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that even today you knew the things that would make for peace." And that's Luke's version of Palm Sunday. He says that Jesus came to change the way we live in this world. He came to bring peace, the peace that the Bible talks about, the shalom, which is the peace that is brought about by reconciliation. It consists in right relationships. It consists in living together in harmony. Karl Barth has this wonderful illustration that says that shalom is like an orchestra of wandering players where each player plays his or her own instrument in improvisation, sort of like jamming for jazz or something, but listening all the time to what other people are playing and then harmonizing with what they hear. And that's what shalom is all about. It's if the angels back at the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem had said, "Peace on earth and good vibrations among all the people of the earth." That is when shalom is here. It's when we're all reconciled and affirming themselves, but also affirming those who are near them, rejoicing with them despite differences. And Jesus wept for his city because they did not know the things that would make for peace. Today, all we have to do is look around us and we see that our civil life is increasingly polarized. It seems that the only alternative that we hold up now to settle disputes is the adversarial model. Seek justice and compensation rather than forgiveness and reconciliation, which is the way of peace. And we immediately assume in almost any conflict that the other side is the enemy and we have to defeat them. Someone has to lose and somebody has to be victorious. And the more pluralistic that we become, the more the tendency we have to identify with a part rather than with the whole, to find our identity in race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, political ideology, which means, friends, that we tend right now to find our identity in what divides us rather than in what unites us. And that same phenomenon is happening everywhere. Religion in particular is, and frankly always has been, used to divide people rather than reconcile them to one another and to God. O Jerusalem, would that you knew the things that made for peace. And as we move into the events of Jesus' last days on earth, how would you address the lament about the reality, his lament about the reality of the way the world is? His angst about the way the world has rejected the message of peace that he came to proclaim. Would you write the story if it was up to you? Well, in my personal rewrite, the world would absolutely get Jesus' message, and the events of Holy Week wouldn't have to happen. And then it dawns on me, after a lot of thought and time, that that's exactly what God does in the resurrection. You see, it's not my job to figure it all out or to even rewrite the story as we tell it every year. But at the same time, it is my job with God as my helper, because on a daily basis from now throughout Holy Week, Easter Sunday, and far beyond, it is our job to rewrite the ending. It's our job as the church. It's our job as Christians in a world filled with vivid scenes where greed and violence reign to help bring about a vision for peace, which is Christ's vision for the world. And as we live into the story that begins here on Palm Sunday, we rewrite the ending, as it were, as we acknowledge that there are, in fact, words that heal. There are words that build. There are words that create. There are words that unite. There are words that can redeem. There are words that can reconcile you to someone from whom you are estranged. There are words that lead to peace. And who will be the people in this society who will speak words of peace? O Jerusalem, would that you knew the ways that make for peace. Jesus will finally enter the city. He'll spend 5 days teaching and then be arrested and executed. At his crucifixion, according to Luke, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Would that you knew the things that make for peace. We who follow Jesus, we do know those things that make for peace. So Palm Sunday, that we have renamed the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, it truly ought to fill us with revulsion at the outcome. It ought to fire us with rebellion at the assumption of its inevitability. It ought to inscribe on faithful hearts the words, "Not again, not this year, not on our watch." Because the Lord needs us to make peace happen. I invite us to rewrite the ending right where we are today. And let's let the world know those things that make for peace. Amen.